The Cabinet Defence Committee paper of the 12th of March, 1957, carried the file reference D-57-63, and within its pages, Duncan Sandys set out a calculation that would govern Royal Air Force operational thinking for the next 12 years. The Vulcan Mark One, then entering squadron service at RAF Waddington, possessed a combat radius of approximately 1,700 nautical miles when carrying a Yellow Sun freefall weapon. Moscow lay 1,520 nautical miles from the East Anglian bomber bases. Leningrad sat closer at 1,200. The industrial complexes of the Urals, including the tank factories at Chelyabinsk and the closed nuclear city of Sverdlovsk 44, lay between 2,100 and 2,400 nautical miles distant. The arithmetic was unforgiving. A crew tasked with striking targets east of the Volga would expend their fuel reaching the release point. There would be no recovery to a friendly airfield, no diversion option, no homecoming. Sir Dermot Boyle, then Chief of the Air Staff, addressed this directly in a memorandum to the Prime Minister dated the 18th of April, 1957. The document, declassified under the 30-year rule and now held at the National Archives at Kew under reference AIR 20/10,412, stated that crews allocated to deep penetration sorties must accept the operational reality that recovery to United Kingdom bases will not, in most foreseeable scenarios, be practicable. The phrasing was bureaucratic. The meaning was not. These were one-way missions in everything but name. The doctrine that emerged from this calculation became known within Bomber Command as the maximum effort sortie. Crews were not officially briefed that they would die. The Air Ministry's training literature, including the classified pamphlet AP 1973-B, issued in 1958, spoke instead of post-strike recovery to designated neutral territory and extended endurance flight profiles. The neutral territories named were Sweden, Finland, Iran, and in some folders, Pakistan. The pamphlet did not mention that Sweden had no agreement to receive nuclear-armed British aircraft, that Finland operated under Soviet political pressure, or that the fuel state required to reach Tehran from a target over the Donetsk Basin was, in the dry phrasing of one group captain at High Wycombe, a matter of considerable optimism. The men selected for V-Force duties understood the arithmetic perfectly well. Squadron leader Peter West, who flew Victor Mark Twos with No. 139 Squadron from RAF Wittering between 1962 and 1965, recorded in a private letter held by the Imperial War Museum's Department of Documents that the crew room conversations turned, with a peculiar frequency, to the question of which Scandinavian forests one might bail out over with the best chance of reaching a fishing village before frostbite. The letter is dated the 7th of November, 1963, 3 weeks after the Cuban Missile Crisis had elevated quick reaction alert from a planning exercise to a near deployment. The structural reality was this. Britain possessed by 1960 180 operational V-bombers split between the Vulcan, the Victor, and the smaller Valiant. The targeting list maintained at High Wycombe designated the Bomber Command Target Committee Program, identified 106 Soviet installations of strategic priority. Of these, 92 lay beyond round-trip range. The crews who would fly against them had been told, in the careful language of British defence policy, that they had a job to do. What they were not told, but what every navigator with a chart and a slide rule could calculate for himself, was that the job ended at the target. The target study room at Headquarters Bomber Command, RAF High Wycombe, occupied the eastern wing of the underground operations bunker known to its inhabitants simply as the Hole. The bunker had been excavated between 1940 and 1942, originally to direct the strategic bombing campaign against Germany, and by 1958 it had been refitted to serve a new and more terrible purpose. The target study room itself was secured behind two doors with combination locks, a Royal Air Force police constable on permanent watch, and a signing-in register that recorded the name, rank, service number, and target folder reference of every officer who entered. The register books from 1961 through 1969 survive in the Air Historical Branch Archive at RAF Northolt. They make for sobering reading. A V-Force captain assigned a primary target would typically spend between 40 and 60 hours in the target study room over the course of a 6-month rotation. The room contained no cameras, no notebooks, and no removable material of any description. Crews entered with empty hands and left the same way. What they took with them existed only in memory. The folders themselves, designated target information sheets and bound in distinctive buff covers stamped UK Eyes Alpha, contained vertical and oblique photographs, ground-level approach, sketches drawn by service intelligence officers, defensive overlays showing surface-to-air missile sites and radar coverage, and a one-page summary giving the target's coordinates, elevation, weapon yield assigned, and aim point offset. The aim point offset mattered because the Yellow Sun Mark II, with its 400 kiloton warhead, did not require precision in the conventional sense. A delivery within 600 yards of the designated coordinates was deemed sufficient. The memorization technique taught at the Bomber Command Bombing School at RAF Lindholm was based on what instructors called terrain association. A pilot would study the approach corridor as if walking through it on foot, identifying landmarks at 30-second intervals from initial point to weapon release. A railway junction here, a bend in a river there, a church spire, a power station chimney, a particular configuration of forest edge against agricultural land. The Soviet Union, by deliberate policy, had removed most navigational landmarks from publicly available maps. The crews therefore worked from imagery obtained by U-2 overflights between 1956 and 1960, supplemented after Gary Power's U-2 overflight 60, supplemented after Gary Power's shoot-down by Corona satellite photography shared under the United Kingdom, United States of America, Mutual Defense Agreement of 1958. What the crews could not photograph, they sketched from memory once safely back in their crew rooms. These private sketches, technically a breach of security regulations, were tolerated by station commanders who understood the human limits of pure recall. Wing Commander Tony Blackman, who flew Vulcans with No. 83 Squadron, wrote in his memoir that crews maintained what he called shadow folders in their lockers, containing pencil drawings of approach features that no sensor had ever seen. The official line was that such material did not exist. The unofficial reality was that men tasked with finding a particular bend in the Volga at 200 feet on a moonless night, after 8 hours of low-level flight, used every aid that human ingenuity could devise. The targets themselves were not chosen at squadron level. The list arrived from the Joint Strategic Target Planning Staff via the Air Ministry's Directorate of Bomber Operations. A Vulcan captain at RAF Scampton in 1963 might find himself studying Saratov on Monday and Volgograd on Thursday, depending on the weekly target rotation. The system was designed so that no single crew became indispensable to any single target, and so that the loss of any individual aircraft by accident or interception did not compromise the overall plan. The folders went back into the safe. The men carried what they had learned. The Joint Intelligence Bureau, established in 1946 and absorbed into the Defence Intelligence Staff in 1964, occupied a series of unremarkable buildings in the Metropole complex off Northumberland Avenue. Its Soviet airfield section, designated JIB/3/A, employed by 1961 a staff of 47 analysts, photographic interpreters, and Russian linguists. Their task was to build and maintain the target folders that V-Force crews would later memorize at High Wycombe. The work was painstaking, slow, and conducted under conditions of secrecy that would have been familiar to the Bletchley Park cryptographers of the previous war. A great many of the senior staff had in fact served at Bletchley. Group Captain Eric Ackerman, who ran the Signals Intelligence Correlation Desk until 1963, had spent the war intercepting Luftwaffe traffic from Cheadle. The raw material arrived from three principal sources. The first was photographic. U-2 overflights conducted between July 1956 and the 1st of May 1960 had produced approximately 400,000 frames of Soviet territory, of which Britain received a substantial share under the bilateral arrangement signed at the Bermuda Conference. After Powers was shot down over Sverdlovsk, the supply continued through the Corona satellite program, which between August 1960 and May 1972 delivered over 800,000 frames of Soviet airfields, missile sites, and military installations. The film canisters returned to Earth by parachute and were processed at Eastman Kodak's facility in Rochester, New York, before duplicate sets were flown to RAF Brampton for analysis by the Joint Air Reconnaissance Intelligence Center. The second source was signals intelligence, gathered by the listening stations at G, C, H, Q, Cheltenham, RAF Chicksands, and the forward sites at RAF Gartow in West Berlin and the Joint Anglo-American Facility at Teufelsberg. Soviet long-range aviation regiments transmitted on identifiable frequencies, used standardized call signs, and conducted exercises that revealed both the location and the operational state of their bases. By cross-referencing radio traffic with photographic confirmation, JIB analysts could determine not merely where Soviet aircraft were stationed, but which regiments held which aircraft, what their alert posture was on a given day, and how their dispersal procedures functioned. The third source, and in many respects the most valuable, was human intelligence. Defectors from the Warsaw Pact air forces brought with them precisely the sort of operational detail that no photograph could capture. The runway surface condition at Engels 2 Air Base, the location of the fuel bowsers relative to the alert hangars, the pattern of guard rotation at the weapons storage area. Lieutenant Franciszek Jarecki, who flew a MiG-15 from Słupsk to Bornholm on the 5th of March 1953, provided the first comprehensive account of Soviet bloc Air Force procedures. Subsequent defectors through the 1950s and 1960s added detail to detail. The interviews were conducted at the London Cage's successor facility at Latchmere House and at a service intelligence safe house near Henley-on-Thames, whose address remained classified until 2011. What emerged from this synthesis was the target folder itself. A typical Soviet bomber base, such as Olenia on the Kola Peninsula, generated a folder running to between 60 and 90 pages. Vertical photography showed the runway layout, the dispersal pans, and the access taxiways. Oblique imagery, where available, gave the approach perspectives a low-flying aircraft would actually see. Annotated overlays marked the positions of anti-aircraft batteries, their fire control radars, and the engagement envelopes calculated by the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. A separate section assessed the target's hardening. By 1965, the analysts could state with confidence that a particular alert hangar at Engels 2 was constructed of reinforced concrete approximately 1 meter thick. requiring a ground burst with a yield not less than 40 kilotons to achieve assured destruction. The shift from high-altitude penetration to low-level ingress occurred between 1963 and 1964, driven by hard evidence from the skies above the Soviet Union. The downing of Powers U-2 on the 1st of May 1960 by an SA-2 guideline missile fired from a battery near Sverdlovsk demonstrated that Soviet air defenses could reach to 70,000 feet. The subsequent loss of Major Rudolf Anderson's U-2 over Cuba on the 27th of October 1962 to the same weapon system confirmed that high-altitude flight was no longer survivable over defended airspace. The Air Council met at Whitehall on the 14th of November 1962 and within 6 weeks had issued a directive, AC/62/41, mandating that V-Force crews train for a low-level penetration profile at 250 feet above ground level. The aeroplanes themselves had not been designed for this. The Vulcan Mark II, with its broad delta wing of 3,964 square feet, had been optimized for high-altitude cruise at 56,000 feet. Bringing it down to terrain following height introduced structural fatigue problems that the de Havilland engineers at Hatfield had not anticipated. The wing skins, originally specified at 0.072 inches of light alloy, were progressively reinforced through 1963 and 1964. And the fleet acquired its distinctive low-level camouflage of dark sea grey and dark green over the previous gloss anti-flash white. The white had been intended to reflect the thermal pulse of one's own weapon. The camouflage was intended to make the aircraft harder to see against the European landscape from above. The training routes were laid out across the parts of the United Kingdom that most resembled, in topographical character, the Western Soviet Union. The Welsh valleys, the Pennine Moors, the Scottish Highlands, and the Lake District became the rehearsal grounds for missions that would, if ever flown, take crews across Belarus, the western Ukraine, and the approaches to Moscow. Low-level Route 1 ran from RAF Machrihanish on the Mull of Kintyre, through the glens of Argyll, across Rannoch Moor, and down through the Cairngorms to a simulated target near Spaddy Adam in Cumberland. Low-level Route 7 traced a path through mid-Wales, with its turning point at Lake Vyrnwy and a release line near the Long Mynd. The routes were flown at 420 knots indicated airspeed, with terrain clearance maintained by visual reference and, after 1965, by the terrain-following radar fitted to the Vulcan Mark II's nose. The complaints from the civilian population were considerable and entirely justified. Hill farmers in Powys reported sheep stampeding into stone walls. Slates were dislodged from cottage roofs in Glencoe. The Member of Parliament for Brecon and Radnor, Carwyn Roderick, raised the matter in the Commons on the 3rd of February 1966, asking the Secretary of State for Defence whether the inhabitants of rural Wales might be informed in advance when V-bombers were to pass overhead at hedge height. The reply, given by Dennis Healy, was that operational security precluded such notification, but that compensation arrangements existed for verified damage. The compensation budget for low-level training damage in the financial year 1966-67 came to £43,200, a figure that gives some indication of the intensity of the programme. For the crews, the routes were rehearsals for sorties they hoped never to fly in earnest. A captain who had flown low-level Route 4 enough times could fly it in his sleep. The bend of the river at Llanrwtyd Wells, the mast on Pumlamon, the disused quarry at Trawsfynydd. These features became, by repetition, the stand-ins for landmarks beyond the curtain that the same men had memorized from buff-covered folders at High Wycombe. The Quick Reaction Alert System became operational on the 1st of January 1962 at the four principal V-Force bases: RAF Waddington, RAF Scampton, RAF Honington, and RAF Cottesmore. The requirement, set out in Bomber Command Operational Order No. 1/62, was that one aircraft per squadron should be capable of becoming airborne within 4 minutes of the receipt of a scramble order. The figure had not been chosen arbitrarily. Royal Aircraft Establishment studies of Soviet ballistic missile flight times had calculated that an SS-4 Sandal launched from Plesetsk would reach East Anglia in approximately 13 minutes. Subtracting the time required for the ballistic missile early warning system at RAF Fylingdales to detect, track, and report the launch, and the time required for the bomber controller at High Wycombe to authenticate and transmit the scramble signal, left the crews with 4 minutes to be wheels up. Anything longer meant the aircraft would be destroyed on the ground. The QRA aircraft sat on dedicated readiness platforms known within the service as ORPs, or Operational Readiness Platforms. These were paved aprons positioned at the threshold of the runway, angled at 35 degrees to permit a 4-aircraft formation start without the delays of taxiing. The aeroplanes stood fully armed and fueled, with their yellow sun or redbeard weapons loaded in the bomb bay, and the cockpit pre-flight checks completed to the point where engine start required only the throw of 3 switches and the press of the rapid start cartridge. The crews lived in a purpose-built accommodation block adjacent to the ORP, sleeping in flying overalls with their helmets and life jackets laid out on chairs beside their bunks. The scramble drill was practiced relentlessly. The bomber controller at High Wycombe could initiate a practice scramble at any hour of the day or night, transmitting the alert via dedicated landlines. A klaxon sounded in the crew block. The men ran the 80 yards to their aircraft, climbed the crew access ladder, and carried out the start sequence while strapping in. The Olympus engines of the Vulcan would light within 12 seconds. The aircraft would taxi onto the runway and accelerate to liftoff within a further 60 seconds. The wheels left the tarmac on a good day at 3 minutes and 50 seconds. The crews kept stopwatches. The cardboard cockpit mock-ups were a private innovation, never officially sanctioned but universally tolerated. A V-Force navigator might construct, on the kitchen table of his married quarter, a representation of his crew position using cardboard panels marked with the locations of the H2S radar controls, the green satin Doppler navigator, and the navigation and bombing system computer. Pilots did the same with their flight instruments. The purpose was to maintain familiarity during periods of leave, when the crew would otherwise lose the muscle memory required to operate the controls without conscious thought. Squadron leader Brian Burnell, who flew Vulcans with No. 49 Squadron, recalled in an oral history recording held at the Imperial War Museum that his children had grown up regarding the cardboard cockpit on the spare room floor as an entirely normal feature of family life. The psychological pressure was considerable and acknowledged at the highest levels. The Royal Air Force Institute of Aviation Medicine at Farnborough conducted a study in 1966, classified at the time and released only in 2004 under reference AVIA 20/1218, which concluded that QR A crews exhibited measurably elevated rates of insomnia, hypertension, and what the report termed anticipatory anxiety. The recommendation was that crews should not serve continuous QRA duty for periods exceeding 72 hours. The recommendation was implemented. The underlying condition, that of waiting for an order that would commit one to a one-way flight, could not be remedied by rotation. The Soviet air defense system that V-Force crews would have faced in 1965 was, by any objective measurement, the most extensive integrated air defense network ever constructed. The Protivovozdushnaya Oborona. Strany, abbreviated as PVO Strany, fielded approximately 3,200 surface-to-air missile launchers, 4,000 interceptor aircraft, and over 10,000 anti-aircraft guns of calibers ranging from 23 mm to 130 mm. The Royal Aircraft Establishment's threat assessment of February 1965, document reference RAE Tech Memo WE/65/12, calculated that a Vulcan flying a low-level penetration profile from the Baltic coast to a target in the Central Soviet Union would cross the engagement zones of approximately 140 SAM batteries and would be subject to interception attempts by between 6 and 9 MiG regiments operating from forward airfields. The SA-2 guideline, designated S-75 Dvina by its operators, was the principal high-altitude threat. Its V-750V missile carried a 190 kilogram fragmentation warhead to an engagement ceiling of 80,000 feet, with a minimum engagement altitude of 1,500 feet. The decision to fly at 250 feet was, in part, a deliberate evasion of this lower limit. The SA-3 Goa, deployed from 1961 onwards, closed that gap, with a minimum engagement altitude of 100 meters and a slant range of 15 kilometers. The SA-4 Ganev, mobile and tracked, appeared in 1964 and complicated the picture further. By 1967, the Joint Intelligence Bureau assessed that no low-level corridor across the Western Soviet Union remained free of overlapping missile coverage. The interceptor force was, if anything, more dangerous still. The MiG-21 Fishbed, then the most numerous Soviet fighter, possessed a maximum speed of Mach 2.05 and was armed with the K-13 infrared-guided missile. A Soviet copy of the American AIM-9 Sidewinder reverse-engineered from a specimen recovered intact from a Taiwanese Sabre engagement in 1958. The Sukhoi Su-9 Fishpot and the later Su-15 Flagon were specialized high-altitude interceptors with look-down radar that, by the late 1960s, could detect a Vulcan against ground clutter. The Tupolev Tu-128 Fiddler, the largest fighter ever to enter operational service, carried 4 AA-5 Ash missiles to engagement ranges of 40 kilometers and was deployed specifically to defend the long Arctic approaches to Soviet territory. Against this, the V-Force possessed limited countermeasures. The Vulcan Mark II carried the red shrimp jamming pod and chaff dispensers, but its principal defense was simply terrain masking and the limited reaction time afforded by low-altitude flight. The Air Warfare Branch's survival probability calculations, conducted by operational research staff at High Wycombe and held under reference AIR 41/943, were sobering. Against undegraded Soviet defenses, in a first-wave attack with no preceding suppression, the calculated probability of any individual aircraft reaching its target was assessed at between 0.3 and 0.4. The probability of subsequently escaping the target area to the planned recovery zone, given fuel state and continued threat exposure, was assessed at below 0.1. The crews knew these figures, or figures very like them. The numbers were not classified to the level that would have prevented squadron commanders from briefing their men on the realities of the mission. Wing Commander Martin Withers, who led the Black Buck raid on Stanley Airfield in 1982 and had served on Vulcan squadrons throughout the 1960s, told the Imperial War Museum's oral history program that crews of his generation operated on the assumption that survival to a friendly territory was a possibility for which one ought to plan, but upon which one ought not to depend. The phrasing was characteristic of the period. The reality it described was unflinching. The Blue Steel standoff missile entered operational service with No. 617 Squadron at RAF Scampton on the 24th of February 1963. Manufactured by AV Avro at the Woodford Works in Cheshire, the weapon represented an attempt to address the unforgiving arithmetic that had governed V-force planning since 1957. By launching the missile at a standoff range of approximately 100 nautical miles from the target, the launching aircraft would not be required to overfly the most heavily defended terminal area. The Mark I round, 35 feet in length and weighing 17,000 pounds, carried a red snow warhead of approximately 1.1 megaton yield and was powered by an Armstrong Siddeley Stentor liquid-fueled rocket motor burning kerosene and high-test peroxide. The technical specifications, declassified in stages through the 1990s and now consolidated in the Defense Research Agency's historical compendium DRA/N93/112, give the missile's maximum range as 150 nautical miles when launched at high altitude. At low altitude, the range collapsed to 50 nautical miles or less. This was not an academic distinction. The doctrinal shift to 250-foot ingress profiles, mandated after the Powers shootdown, had reduced Blue Steel to a weapon of marginal utility. A Vulcan crew launching from low level near the Soviet frontier would still be required to penetrate the outer defensive belt before release. The 100-mile cushion existed largely on paper. The handling of the weapon presented difficulties of its own. High-test peroxide, the oxidizer, was hypergolic with virtually any organic material and decomposed violently on contact with rust, dust, or human skin. The fueling procedure at Scampton required ground crews in full protective suits, with the missile loaded onto its trolley in a dedicated facility known to the men who worked there as the bomb dump, though the official designation was the supplementary storage area. Several incidents occurred during the weapon's service life. On the 17th of June, 1964, a peroxide leak at RAF Scampton resulted in a fire that destroyed one missile and damaged a second. The subsequent Court of Inquiry, whose findings were summarized in Air Ministry Document AM/64/217, recommended modifications to the fueling procedure and the storage trolleys, but did not question the fundamental wisdom of housing a megaton warhead alongside a tank of self-igniting oxidizer. The strategic compromise embedded in Blue Steel was, in the end, untenable. The missile bought the launching aircraft a margin of perhaps 15 minutes of additional life, depending on the target and the launch geometry. It did not buy a return ticket. The fuel calculations remained as they had been. A Vulcan that had penetrated to a release point 200 miles inside Soviet territory and had then turned for home at the moment of release, still faced an egress flight of at least 600 miles through degraded but not eliminated air defences with insufficient fuel to reach the United Kingdom. The recovery options remained the same neutral airfields that had appeared in the original briefings, and the same reservations applied to each. The Mark II Blue Steel, which would have offered genuine extended range through the use of solid fuel ramjet propulsion, was cancelled in December 1959 on grounds of cost and timescale. The Skybolt air-launched ballistic missile, an American program into which Britain had invested heavily, was cancelled by the Kennedy administration in November 1962, leaving Macmillan to extract the Polaris agreement at Nassau the following month. The decision committed the United Kingdom's strategic deterrent to the Royal Navy from 1969 onwards. For the V Force, the implication was that their role had a defined termination date. The folders at High Wycombe would close. The men would disperse. The transfer of the strategic nuclear deterrent from the Royal Air Force to the Royal Navy occurred at midnight on the 30th of June, 1969. The submarine HMS Resolution, on patrol in the North Atlantic with 16 Polaris A3 missiles aboard, assumed the continuous at-sea deterrent posture that the Royal Navy has maintained without interruption ever since. At RAF Waddington, RAF Scampton, RAF Cottesmore, and RAF Honington, the QRA aircraft were stood down. The Yellow Sun and Redbeard weapons were withdrawn to the Royal Air Force Armament Support Unit at RAF Wittering for storage and eventual decommissioning. The buff-covered target folders went into the safe at High Wycombe and stayed there. By Christmas of 1969, the Vulcans had been reassigned to a conventional bombing role within Supreme Allied Commander Europe's Tactical Strike Forces, a transition that the crews greeted with a mixture of relief and disorientation that several memoirs have struggled to articulate. What the men carried out of the cockpits and into civilian life was not, in any straightforward sense, a secret. The targets had been classified. The aircraft and their weapons had been classified. The route maps and the threat assessments had been classified. The fact of the matter, however, that British aircrew had spent a decade preparing to fly missions from which they would not return, was not classified. It was simply unspoken. The Official Secrets Act bound the men against discussing operational specifics, but it did not require them to discuss anything at all, and most chose not to. The interviews recorded by the Imperial War Museum's sound archive between 1990 and 2010, accessible under reference numbers in the 11,000 and 12,000 series, contain a remarkable consistency of tone. The men, by then in their 60s and 70s, spoke of their service with neither bravado nor regret. They had done a job. The job had not, in the end, required them to die. They were quietly grateful for that. Several mentioned that they had not told their wives the full nature of the mission until the men were retired and the deterrent had passed to the Navy. Squadron leader Robert Prothero, who flew Vickers from Wittering between 1963 and 1968, told his interviewer in 1998 that his wife had asked him, on the morning of the Cuban Missile Crisis stand down, where the aeroplane would be going. He had told her Sweden. She had asked when he would be back. He had not answered. The historical assessment of the V-Force one-way mission doctrine has shifted considerably since the records began to open in the 1990s. Earlier accounts, written when much of the documentation remained classified, tended to treat the airborne deterrent as a transitional phase between the Second World War strategic bombing campaign and the modern submarine-based nuclear posture. More recent scholarship, including the work of Professor John Bayliss at Aberystwyth and the late Sir Lawrence Freedman at King's College London, has placed greater emphasis on the human dimension. The men who sat QRA at Waddington in October 1962 were, by any reasonable definition, prepared to die in the service of a deterrent posture whose entire purpose was to ensure that they would not have to. The paradox was understood at the time and is not diminished by hindsight. The airfields they had memorized remained where they were: Engels II on the Volga, Olenia on the Kola Peninsula, Tartu in Estonia, Mary in Turkmenistan, Anadyr on the Bering Strait. Some have since closed. Others continue in operation with the Russian Federation's Air Force. The bend of the river, the configuration of the alert hangars, the position of the surface-to-air missile batteries. These details, fixed in memory at High Wycombe between 1961 and 1969, faded slowly with the men who carried them.